Lise Weil, who's speaking to us from Montreal. Go ahead.
Okay, to get rid of this unmute okay. Yeah, hi. I loved that, Paul. I just had a bit of nostalgia for Western Mass because Paul and I were talking about how when I lived there in the 80s, it was a time Paul lived right where I used to live in Montague and North Leverett. It was such a hotbed of radical thought and creativity. And just listening to those poems, Paul, that brought me back there. I just have to start. First of all, thank you for, I don't know who's there, but thank you for being there when there's so much incredibly exciting stuff happening on the streets right now. But it's wonderful that you're here. And speaking of who's here, I wasn't able to do this via screen share, so I'm gonna do it via just doing this, showing you. This is who is here in Montreal right now. Can you see that? I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it? It's a whale. It's a humpback whale who's come to Montreal for the first time in recorded history. And we think that it's because there has been no shipping traffic. And so it's an adolescent, so I think it's a he, got lost and is visiting us, maybe didn't get lost, is out there in the old port making so many human beings so happy, including me. I went down there and I got to see him gambling and I took some photos, terrible photos, but just I'm aware that he's there. And I just have to show you that by coincidence, when I turned to June 1st on my calendar, there's a humpback whale leaping in the exact same image. So I'm feeling blessed by whales. It's really odd to be speaking to, I see only 3 people. I don't know who's listening. And that's why I've asked Lise to say, if you have questions, say so, because I just don't know who you are or what is it that you really want to hear. So it'll really be helpful to me if you do say, please say more about that, or I didn't get that, whatever. But before I get into my actual talk, I want to also say that the reason that I'm here is because the Montreal Climate March, which had 500,000 people marching, okay, I was just about ready to leave. I'd had my fill of this incredible energy. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna go. And I just saw this woman sitting at the foot of a statue with a big sign saying, "The earth is sacred," in French and in English. And until that moment, although I had seen every kind of sign you can imagine, no sign had ever said anything about the sacredness of the earth. And I went and sat down next to this person, and it was Lise. And we started talking, and I said, well, what? She didn't live here. She lives in Western Mass. I said, I lived in Western Mass. She had a book in her purse. It was the Overstory. I was reading the Overstory. And then I wrote down my name, and she said, that's my name, because my name looks like it's pronounced Lise, and her name is pronounced Lise. My name is actually pronounced Lisa. So it was just one thing after another. Now we have this whole back and forth. She's been over for a solstice event, and now she invited me to be part of this. So really we owe it to the sacred earth, which I may or may not come back around to the whale and the sacred earth, but if I don't, well, I hope I do, because that feels really important to what I want to say. Yeah, so the parallels, and I was so glad to be invited because I'm probably going to talk more than I'm going to read from my memoir, because there's a lot of stuff happening now, and it's exciting. I mean, some of it is obviously really hard, but so much of it is exciting to me. And honestly, I have been thrown back to those years. At the last, as I was writing this book, which took me 18 years to write, which I should show you, it's called In Search of Pure Lust. It took me 18 years to write it. And at the end, I kept thinking, who's going to care about this movement that happened in the 70s and the 80s, all these lesbian feminists, blah, blah, blah. You know, in these last months, I have felt that those words mattered more than ever. And as a matter of fact, it's felt as if these last months have created almost a kind of acoustic chamber that allowed the words that were written and spoken and sung at that time to resonate even more powerfully than they did in that moment. And so I really actually want to start by reading some poems that were written in that moment. And actually most of them were written in the exact same year, or in the years between 1976 and 1978. They were just extraordinary in terms of vision and output. And I just want to read 3. And I think you'll understand why in these last months I have been thrown back to them. And the first is from 2 of the books I'm going to read from. The front covers have come off because they've been like Bibles for me. So this is from Adrienne Rich's poem, Transcendental Etude, which is from Dream of a Common Language. But there come times, perhaps this is one of them, when we have to take ourselves more seriously or die. When we have to pull back from the incantations, rhythms we've moved to thoughtlessly, and disenthrall ourselves, bestow ourselves to silence or a severer listening, cleansed of oratory, formulas, choruses, laments, static crowding the wires. We cut the wires, find ourselves in free fall, as if our true home were the undimensional solitudes, the rift in the great nebula. No one who survives to speak new language has avoided this, the cutting away of an old force that held her rooted to an old ground, the pitch of utter loneliness, where she herself and all creation seem equally dispersed, weightless, her being a cry to which no echo comes or can ever come. I don't know about you, but in the last months, I've heard the word listen, listen, listen so many times. And it has felt like a time when deep listening was possible, if for no other reason than it was quiet. And also, it felt like many people were talking about surviving in order to speak new language. That has felt like a theme for me. I want to read from Beginning with O by Olga Brumas, another foundational text for me, for many of us at that time, from a poem called Artemis. I am a woman committed to a politics of transliteration, the methodology of a mind stunned at the suddenly possible shifts of meaning, for which, like amnesiacs in a ward on fire, we must find words or burn. Stunned at the suddenly possible shifts of meaning. That has felt so true to me in these last months. I'm sure all of you have had a sense, at least of, at several moments, of just these astonishing possibilities that you were never able to see before. For which we must find words or burn. Yeah, I have felt that way too. a sense of, yeah, if we don't start to find this new language now, when will it, when if not now? And the last poem I have to read from, just because of the tremendous sense of, again, it's the sense of tremendous suffering and hardship, and then possibility side by side, what's happening now in our streets and in our consciousnesses since the killing of George Floyd. It's just, I have to read something from Audre Lorde as well. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, this poem is called A Litany for Survival. Learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. The heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. I don't know if you can see what I mean about this echo chamber or this acoustic, the way that we can hear those words now in the context of what we're seeing, what we've been seeing, even just in mainstream media over the last week. It gives me a lot of hope, actually, that 40 years later, words can maybe, can find a resonance that they didn't even have at the time, and can resound in places they would not have resounded before, maybe even globally. So, so yes, I've been thrown back to these visionary writers and artists of that moment. And I did feel at the time, as I feel now, that a window had opened and allowed us to see things that we hadn't seen, maybe in millennia, and a veil had lifted, and which is how I've been feeling lately. Yeah, it was such an extraordinary moment. I don't know if there's anyone else listening who was there and who knows. I think Lise knows it a little bit. And I wrote the book in part to chronicle this movement, because to this day, it was the most exciting moment in my life. I feel so lucky to have been part of it. If I just name some of the writers I've just read from: Judy Grahn, Mary Daley, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, Susan Griffin, Christos, Paula Gunn Allen, Gloria Anzaldúa, Pat Parker, Monique Wittig. I have to name the ones from Quebec and France because I'm Nicole Brossard, Jovette Marchessault. These were all people who sparked our minds and our hearts, and there were singers as well. There were music concerts. There was an entire culture, and I wanted to chronicle that culture, and I did that as well as I could in my book. I also wanted to chronicle our failings. So in a way, my book is a critical reflection on that moment, and I will get to that if there's time and if there's interest. But really, what I want to talk about is what we were able to see. And I'll read from my book a little bit in terms of what it was that we were visioning for. It felt like the first time.
We have one question that came in. This is from Kathy San Antonio. And she says, "Hi, Lisa. Yes, I was there. This is Kathy from Western Mass. We met at Smith College a couple of years ago,
Oh, hi. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I remember you. And you probably went to Chapin's, didn't you?
she says, and then as now, what you're saying is very resonant for me.
Thank you. So this moment, for those of you who weren't there, and maybe those of you who were, like to be reminded, it was cultural, it was spiritual, it was political, and it was erotic. Don't forget that Audre Lorde's The Power of the Erotic was written in that moment in the late 70s, and it was a foundational text for us. And it still is. I mean, I find that people are talking about that text in particular now more than I've heard them talking about it in the last 30 or 40 years. Anyway, I think it might be hard to imagine now how much we were just reinventing everything from the ground up, and just questioning all received truths, thinking completely outside the box. And also, one of the things that's hard to imagine now, and that's for very hard economic reasons, is that we were able to see our visions and our thoughts and our desires manifested in the world around us in very material ways. So it was incredibly gratifying that from what we were imagining would spring, concerts, coffee houses, performance spaces, readings, festivals, literary festivals, music festivals. And in my case, what sprang from it was this journal, Trivia, a journal of ideas, which it came out of a study group that I was in Western Massachusetts. And that study group actually grew out of Mary Daley's classes. Then it evolved from there. But I thought I would read a little bit from the book about that, because I was living in North Leverett, actually living in Mary Daley's house. And she and I never did get along, but she was very grouchy. But I was honored to be living in her house. And I wanted to just give you a feel for that. For why this moment was so powerful. Well, one of the things is we really felt we were on an edge. And we were on an edge, but this is kind of how we experienced it. We were the first in recorded history to see as we saw. Never before in this span of time had the perceptions of women entered the realm of representation. Never before had women in large numbers attempted to reclaim not only our own bodies, but the body of knowledge that had been stolen from us. No one in recorded history had lived or loved this way before. We really did feel that. And the way we lived and loved, we were certain of this, was of significance for all living beings. I guess I haven't said that I'm talking about lesbians here, mainly. I mean, lesbian desire was the main engine of the movement that I was part of, desire for women. And in that desire for women, and this is why it wasn't only lesbians, in that desire for women was this desire that was so huge for a world that centered women, that centered nature, and that was not violent, that was a peaceful world that we could actually live in and not feel crazy. And does that sound familiar? Anyway, that was our desire. And in our case, as lesbians, in loving women, maybe I should speak for myself, but my desire for women was never it was very sexual, but it was never just that. It was so big. I felt like when I was holding the women, I was holding the possibility for another world. So, and that's one reason I've called it the most embodied revolution ever, because it really did come from this embodied desire. And it also foundered on that. So I'll get to that later if there's time. But Yeah, so the edge we were on, what we saw from that edge. Oh yeah, Paul wants to ask a question. Go ahead. Ask a question, Paul.
Real quick, I'll figure out how to make this a short question. So the Women's Music Festival,
Yeah,
big one in Michigan, that's closed now. And
yeah.
many lesbian friends that I know say, does anybody remember us now in the mix of transgender and all the new definitions that people have now? I mean, I can remember as a male, people maybe said, oh, I was bisexual so that they could hide still, as if, I'm still involved with what everyone thinks is the real love.
I'm plugging in my computer now. I'm not leaving. This
Okay.
question is not
But
personal.
anything you want to say about that, because it could be a whole talk, but anything you'd want to say around that and what went on and where you feel you are now and how that relates to the energy that you were feeling.
That's a great question. And is it okay if I hold that until after I've gone through a lot of this stuff?
Oh yeah, no, that's great.
Was that none of that? I'm really now sort of back inside then, and what you're saying brings us into now, and it goes together with what I'm saying is critical reflection. But first, I really want to give a feeling for then. Okay?
Oh yeah, that's great.
A good question.
There's another question coming in from B. Jacques, and she asks, could you also explain who Mary Daley was?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, and I just think, I don't know where you're all zooming in from, but if people in Western Mass don't know who Mary Daley is, that's kind of upsetting, because yeah, well, but I'll talk about Mary Daley now in a second. Actually, I'm just getting to her now. So what we saw from that place, this edge that we were standing on, was that our civilization was teetering on a brink. And our starting point, and this was true for me, it was true for the women that I collaborated with, that I created trivia with, and it was true for the writers that really sparked me, that informed all of my thinking. The starting point was that something was deeply, deeply wrong with the way we were living, with the way things were set up. I mean, we were not reformists in that way. We were radical, radical thinkers. We knew something was really deeply wrong. And feminism was a civil rights thing, but it was so much more than that. And this is where Mary Daley comes in. And this is actually a well-timed question, because the other book I have that the cover has come off is Mary Daley's Gynecology. And in Gynecology, in the intro, she says, "This is an extremist book, written in a situation of extremity, written on the edge of a culture that is killing itself and all of sentient life." And that's basically what Gynecology was. That was the starting point for this book. A meta-ethics of radical feminism was the subtitle. And basically why this book was so important to us was that it connected the dots in a way it had never been done, to show that woman hatred and what Mary Daley called necrophilia was global, that it was all over the world, and she cited instances of it all over the world. Gynecology also was controversial because, and more people know about Audre Lorde's letter to Mary Daley about gynecology than they do about gynecology itself. I mean, if you were all here, I would ask for a show of hands. And I just, generally people know that Audre Lorde wrote in to complain that while she had figured African women as sufferers of clitoridectomy, she did not include them in the pantheon of goddesses. And that was a true oversight. And Mary Daley wrote back and asked for a meeting. That meeting didn't happen. And instead, word went down that Mary didn't want to meet her, didn't want to talk about her, which was actually false. And the record has been corrected in Alexis DeVoe's biography of Audre Lorde. But Mary suffered a great deal from that, because from that point on, especially white women who were wanting to look like allies were going around saying, don't read this book, it's racist. And that was not Audre Lorde's intention. Audre Lorde had tremendous respect for the work that Mary Daley did in this book. She was trying to offer a constructive comment. And that's how Mary took it, but that's not how but see, now I'm getting into critical reflection, and I didn't mean to do that right away. But we didn't know how to do these things at the time. And that's, I think that's one of the things that brought the movement down. We didn't know how to take in criticism and do a course correction and stuff like that. So, but I also wanted to read one other thing that Mary Daley wrote about patriarchy, which isn't a word that we use so much now. But when we say colonization, I think we're talking a lot about patriarchy. She called it the religion of reversals. And she said, it's the omnipresence of reversal, whose ultimate meaning is reversing life engendering energy, symbolized by the goddess, into necrophilic nothing loving. And I think necrophilic nothing loving might be a good way to name, especially if you look at the current US administration. There's a lot of necrophilic nothing loving going on now. And I think Mary Daley did as good job of naming those forces as anyone ever has. So, yeah, where was I? Yeah, so we started from, the point we started from is something is deeply wrong. And that's, I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of the German writer Christa Wolf. She was really important to me, but she wrote a speech that she gave when she was given the Büchner Prize. It was in Berlin that she gave the speech. And one of the things she said in the speech was, the conditions, for translation, the condition of the world is wrong. We say tentatively and then realize it is true. And the word in German is verkehrt, which means upside down, which means completely out of whack. So she was another one of the people that we felt were our collaborators. It wasn't just people in North America who saw this, something is deeply wrong. And that needs to be our starting point, you know? We can't just make little changes here and there. It has felt like the last months I have felt so returned to that. And now it isn't just parts of the world. I felt like all of us were sensing that there is something that's deeply wrong, you know, kind of making radicals of all of us who were listening, who were really listening. And that's another reason why these words have felt so present to me. I honestly have been going back and rereading essays and poetry from that time. And it's just, I highly recommend it. It's been amazing.
We have another question that came in.
Yeah.
This is from Karma Kitaj. She writes, as a straight woman who was steeped in feminism in the Boston area in the 1970s, I wonder if you will talk about the takeaways from that period for now, based on your experiences back then.
Yeah, well, that's kind of, maybe I could ask the question, or that's what I thought I was doing. So maybe there's something more specific that you'd like me to say. Maybe let me just talk a little more. And if you still are not getting it, because what I'm about to say actually may speak to what you're asking. I'm about to talk about the way we were able to make connections. I mean, I think that was, if anything, the thing that broke open for us when we were standing on this edge. And I don't know if you, the questioner, also felt you were standing on an edge and looking out, but that we were seeing how one thing connected to another. We saw in 1980, and this questioner might not have known about this incredible action at the Pentagon where women held hands and circled the Pentagon. Lise, do you know about this action? And we were protesting everything. it was pulling it all together. It was the murder of Anna Mae Aquash, a First Nations woman in Canada. And it was also militarism. And I love that we were circling the Pentagon and holding hands. And it was ecocide and racism. I swear to God, we were really connecting the dots in this moment. And don't let anyone tell you that intersectional thinking only began in this century. If you were in Boston in the 1980s, you know that women were talking about racism constantly. We didn't know how to talk about it. And we didn't do a great job. But we were, the first analyses of class and race and disability were generated in the 70s and mostly in the 80s. So we were intersectional and we were connecting the dots. And that was so invigorating. It was so exciting. We were on this edge of discovery all the time. And yeah, this was obviously not just lesbians. So I'm wondering if that questioner wants to refine the question or has a further question about that. No, okay. So I'm going to get a little, okay, my own awakening. How did that happen? And I want to stop, and I don't want to talk a whole lot more, but I want to read a little more from the book about my own personal awakening. I was a graduate student at Brown University and getting more and more disenchanted with higher education. And, there were no women writers and certainly no writers of color on any of our set book lists. And I saw this ad in the Lesbian Connection, because I had just come out, for this place in Cazenovia, New York, called the Women's Writers Center. And I just decided, okay, I'm going to do this for a whole year. I'm going to go and study at this place. And I did. And we had, as visiting writers that year, we had Adrienne Rich for a whole week. We had Olga Brumas for a whole week, the two poets I just read from. Audre Lorde had been there previously. Judy Grahn was there the next year, and Muriel Rukeyser had been there 2 years before. It was extraordinary. And it really, some of you know Kate Clinton. She was a student there with me at that time. She hadn't yet started doing stand-up comedy, but had she not come to the Writers Center that year, I have a feeling that would never have happened. We all got so radicalized. So just gonna read a tiny little thing about how that, okay. Pay attention to what they tell you to forget, wrote the poet Muriel Rukeyser. I just love, pay attention to what they tell you to forget, who had been visiting faculty at the center the previous year and whom Bella invoked often in class. Because we were not only writing at this place, we were studying. We were studying women writers, and really just, it was a school. It was a school. When I think back now to how everything changed for me that year, those words seem to sum it all up. The problem with grad school, I was coming to understand, was not the mind. It was what the mind had been asked to do and what it had been asked to ignore. Here at the center, we were reclaiming intuition and magic as vital sources of knowledge. We were waking up to nature. We were tuning into our bodies, our senses. We were learning to put thinking in the service of ourselves, of our own questions. It was all the pieces coming together for the first time. It was coming to see how fragmented my life had been before. It was overthrowing all the male authorities who had ever ruled in my head. Susan Griffin's Woman in Nature and Adrienne Rich's Dream of a Common Language, each in its own way a challenge to the male paradigm of knowledge, had been published that year, as had Judy Grahn's The Work of a Common Woman and Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic as Power. All of them were passed feverishly from hand to hand throughout the fall. They kept us company in our subversions. Still today, when I read passages from Woman in Nature, I see the rolling hills of upstate New York and those rushing streams. I hear those honking geese. So that'll give you an idea. I mean, can you imagine a school like that? It was more rigorous than I'd been to 2 Ivy League schools, by the way, and this was a more rigorous education, and it was a blow the top of your head off education than I had ever had in any of the schooling that I had before. And it really opened me up to do the work that I really needed to do in the world, which included founding Trivia, which, as I say, came out of the study group, the Western Massachusetts Study Group. And maybe, I don't know, I'll show you some issues of Trivia. Some of you know it, but this was issue number, oh, well, this is the controversial issue that, this was the last issue that we put out, Trivia Journal of Ideas, and issue number, first issue, historic, and I don't even know if you can see those, but yeah, they all came out of the study group that I was in Western Mass, which is where I moved from the Women's Writers Center to Boston, and then I fell in love with a woman who was living in Mary Daley's house. This is all in the book, because, well, I should tell you, the book actually, the through line of the book is my love affairs. I don't want to make it sound like this is just a book about my, I don't know, political evolution. It's very much about my love life, and how I just fell in love, because I fell in love over and over, deeply and madly, and I was on fire every time. And so I moved to Western Mass because I had fallen in love with this woman, and she lived in Mary Daley's house, and then I became part of the study group, and then Trivia, the journal, emerged out of the study group. But then, you know, but we were all on fire, and I think that's one of the things I'm trying to convey, is it was a very fiery time. And I came to realize in the process of writing the book that I had this connection to that time because of my fire. You know, I'm a Sag, and I have a lot of air, and the air is like a bellows, and it makes me really passionate, but it has its liabilities, and especially in love. I couldn't really seem to be able to sustain any of those relationships, and they came apart in really awful ways. And so I wrote the book also in order to try to understand and to heal from all of that. And in the process, I felt like I was also coming to understand and heal from the ways in which it didn't work out for us as a movement, and the ways in which we weren't able to talk across differences, because as long as we were talking about our mutual discoveries, we were loving on each other, just loving on each other. And then, you know, when stuff came up, race and class and anti-Semitism and disability, it was, I mean, these were necessary conversations, but from my perspective, we didn't know how to have them. And I think what I'm realizing is I'm going to wait and see if anyone wants me to read from any more, because I'd rather leave room for questions and say a little bit about what I wanted to say about now, because I really do feel, I'm a Sag, so I tend to be hopeful, but if you watch what's happening, this is what's happening around the world right now, these marches. It's amazing. And, but I'm feeling hopeful, partly because I see that maybe sometimes you have to wait 40 years to see the words that have been written that mattered so much to you, that were written by your collaborators, actually take effect, be heard you know, and be enacted in a big way. And I'm not just talking about the race stuff now, because, you know, I mean, this feminist stuff is happening in a big way. I think we're getting it. I think we're understanding the deep impulses for our movement, which is that we want a world that is centered in love and life engendering, to use Mary Daley's words. And that things have been upside down, they've been reversed. And and in the last months, I don't know about you, but it felt like I have heard more radical thinking. In other words, really going to the root, really saying something is deeply wrong, and what are we going to do, than I have in the 40 years since, or now 42 since gynecology was published and Dream of a Common Language. So, and I will just say one other thing that makes me hopeful. Is that I think one of the reasons we were not able to have these difficult conversations, we were on fire and we wanted to stay on fire. We were not looking at wounds. We were not looking at our wounds. We were not looking at trauma. And we're now seeing conversation that is really trauma informed and that is really heart centered. And I guess this is where the whale is going to come back in. My life was changed by a trip to see the whales in Baja 5 years ago, and I feel like the whales are here to help us right now. A lot of non-human beings are here now to help us. I think the ancestors are here to help us, and I think many of us are starting to feel this and know that whatever we do, our thinking and our acting and our movements need to be centered in our hearts. I know that's what the whales have conveyed to me. Mm. And knowing all of this does make me feel like we now are on this other edge. You know, we're at another gap in time where we can see. We can see now. The window is open again. The veil has lifted. And it makes me feel that this time around, maybe it's gonna unfold differently. And this one will be able to sustain whatever actions, whatever movements come out of this moment, that we can sustain them and they will do the work that needs doing. That's my prayer. That's really what I most want to say. And I know I didn't read much from my book, but it's, if you have any requests, I'll be happy to read sections of it. But that's what I really wanted to say. And if there's no questions, I'll read a couple more things from the book.
There are 3 questions for you. One is easy. Do you have a website or blog?
Yeah, just go to my name. And then, www.liseweil.com. And there you can also find out about this journal that I edit, Dark Matter Women Witnessing, which, I mean, what I said in the last minutes it's really devoted to humans in relation to the non-human world, and looking at, I founded it in 2014, but it's because I think dark matter this is a moment for dark matter right now, looking at the dark. Yeah, in all senses of the word. But thank you. Yeah, that's my website.
The next one is a follow-up from the earlier questioner, Karma. She says, I guess I'm looking for some prescriptions for how I can be active and involved in change movements now, given my concerns about gathering in large groups. I'm a writer, so I'm comfortable using that modality to express myself. I don't want to interrupt your flow now, but wanted to respond to your question that you had asked her earlier.
Yeah. You know, here's an interesting thing. And I never thought I would say this because I am so I've been really anti-Zoom, anti-technology. Let's meet I teach embodiment studies at Goddard, right? But the fact is that in the last months, I've had some of the deepest conversations, the deepest connections, and in groups at one time was a group of 24 women. And I did wish God, it was really hard because I really love some of these. It was hard not to be with them, but you can make incredible connections with this technology. You can you can meet with people that you otherwise couldn't meet with. That's what we're all discovering all around the world. So I've been convening groups of alumni, Goddard alumni, that I could never have otherwise been in conversation with. And I don't know where to tell you to look, but let your heart lead the way. And hey, you know, you can ask me on the side too. You can get my email address on my site, and we can brainstorm together maybe.
Okay, so a kind of a related question to that says, from Celia Lang, I sat in with other senior women on your talk to women and gender class at Smith College.
Oh, that was wonderful. I loved that.
Your perspective was a gift to those young women students. Would you please speak to your observation of the great number of young people organizing in the streets today? Sounds like you answered this while I was typing. Perhaps you could share what you are reading now of emerging voices.
Young people are making me so hopeful. They're just doing amazing stuff. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg. I know how to pronounce her name because I'm half Norwegian. I mean, look at and young people are the ones who are saying also, not looking away, looking inside too. You know, we got to look at the hard stuff inside ourselves. So, and I was so happy at that day at Smith. I just loved to talk to the young people. I understood that they're really starved to know about what lesbians are, you know, what the lesbians in the 80s and the 70s were talking about in the same place in Western Mass, that they're hungry to know that, just as we're hungry to know what you're all about. And it felt like such an important bond. You know, it is so important that we speak to each other across the generations. So, I mean, that day really meant a lot to me at Smith. I had wished there was a way to keep going with those connections, and I don't know, maybe we'll still find one.
Here's another question from Jupong Lin, who I think you know.
Yes, I do.
She says, I really appreciate Lisa's comments about intersectional thinking. While it's true there was awareness of racism, my experience of feminism in the 80s was that racism within the movement really divided different feminists.
Yeah.
What do you think we've learned from that time that has enabled the current evolution of the movement?
What do you think we've learned from that time? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Or do you think
what do you think we've learned from that time that has enabled the current evolution of the movement?
Well, we laid the groundwork, didn't we, with the analyses and with the diagnosis. I mean, you know, we laid it out with the diagnosis. We saw it. We didn't know how to heal it. So I think we laid the foundation, but we weren't able to do the really hard talking work and by the way, I don't know if you were at the conversation. Were you there yesterday, Jupong?
No,
I wasn't. I thought it was incredible. I've never heard anything like it. We both teach at Goddard, and yesterday the president convened a special meeting to talk about what's been happening. I thought it was the best conversation I've ever heard about race at Goddard, and it was so from the heart. I loved it. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think we learned from our mistakes.
Yeah, now that you say that, I was on that conversation.
Yeah.
And so this is, you know, I think this is what my question is coming out of this very different experience of, so that, you know, conversation yesterday, you're saying you thought it was the best conversation we've had about race at Goddard, whereas I know that some of the women of color, especially the Black women, found that conversation very, very difficult. Yeah. And because they didn't feel that we got to a place of really even touching on healing the wound.
No, it wasn't it wasn't there. It was the first stage. And I hope we keep going, but I understand why they felt that way. It felt like a first step that they could even say that, so that it's supposed to be the first of many. But anyway, yeah, I hear that too. I'm so sorry. We probably shouldn't talk about this.
Yeah, sorry.
We can email about it, but yeah, I heard that too. But maybe I should also, unless there's other questions, go back to the question that was asked about Michigan. Paul, that was your question. And yeah, that was one of the blind spots. That it wasn't on my radar at the time that much. It didn't come up so much, but yeah, it has divided us a lot, the trans movement. And one of the things I want to say, I've had to learn a lot. I've had to do a lot of thinking and feeling about this. And one of the things I want to mention is that a book that has given me so much hope is by a trans woman named Chen Tong. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. And it's called I Hope We Choose Love. And it's one of the best books I've ever read about movement activism, because we're now seeing a lot of really good writing about the dysfunction in our social justice movements. And I think that's one of the best ones ever written. And I may have felt at one time threatened, to be really honest, by some of the ways in which the trans movement seem to conflict with feminist thinking. And I'm really in a process about that. But all I want to say is that I'm very, very moved by a lot of the writing and thinking that I'm seeing coming out of the trans movement. It feels so important. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm aware that there's a conflict there.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, it does. It's one part of it. The other thing, in terms of you were talking about what gave you hope, like that women's festival was one example of the amazing power and an event that just affected so many women who went there and afterwards, and now it's gone.
Yeah.
And there's many things in both of our lives, because we're both, in that age group where we saw our values created and celebrated, and then they're gone. And you're trying to hold on to some of that. So anything you can speak to that. I mean, I find watching the youth today gives me that, but there's other things too.
To feel that it's gone, but I don't.
No, to feel that you have the hope again, to not see that as a law, not to see that as a failure.
Yeah.
Like it was a great thing that happened at that festival,
Like I get feed where the women's music, the Michigan Women's Music Festival is not, Apple, get out of my, is still alive in the minds and hearts of many women.
Right.
And no matter, I mean, for me, yes, there's disagreement about their policy, the Women-Born Women policy. But for me, that has not tarnished what it actually did and how many lives were permanently changed by that festival. It's an incredibly important institution. So, yeah, I don't feel like it's been lost. In the same way that, as I'm saying, I mean, I'm feeling like total resurgence of the thinking, just to know it hasn't died. There's a time for, I feel like the words of Mary Daley are going to be heard again now, can be heard again, because we're now in hearing range.
Mm.
So maybe attached to that is another comment question from Kay Messina, who writes, crucial to document lesbian women in 1970s and 80s. Please keep going.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to be the only one. I hope everyone, go back and read the books, or read my book, and you'll want to go back and read all the other books. I guess I should put, like, if this were actually a reading, you would actually see my book also. I should put it up again. In Search of Pure Lust. My partner did the cover. Is that beautiful or what? I should say that I have had someone in my life now for 26 or 7 years, so I did heal some of my failings in love. I have managed to make some progress. And like I say, I see that same progress being made on the collective level. But you do have to go back to the wounds. You have to go and look at the dark stuff. And that is another thing that I do in the book. go and look at the shadow, which dreams are really big in the book. And that's kind of what I was doing with the movement, trying to look at the shadow of our feminist movement. There's one scene in which I was living in Montague at the same time as Adrienne Rich and Michelle Clark, and Audre Lorde was a frequent guest. So I would see her walking on the streets, but I was just dimly aware that we were on different sides of a divide at the time, because Mary Daley and Adrienne Rich had split up. I was going to read you this section of the book, but I think I'll just try to say it because there's only a few minutes left. But so anyway, we were invited, my co-editor Anne and I were invited to cross the street and have a tea with Adrienne and Michelle. And I was so excited, and I thought, I'm going to get to tell Adrienne that her words are behind everything we do. We quote her poems to each other all the time. And they, by that time, had become editors of Sinister Wisdom, this other wonderful lesbian publication. And we thought it would be this time where we could celebrate our journals and talk about the work we were doing in the world, but it was not possible. We had this polite conversation about what was growing in the garden and the street life in Montague, and it was clear that we weren't supposed to go any further than that. And when we got home, I said to Anne, why do you think we couldn't really talk? And she said, don't you understand? We're in Mary Daley's camp. I said, what? She said, yeah. I hadn't really realized that we were in camps at all, but that was the beginning of my understanding that there were already at the time, there were these, at the time it was around the sex, it was around sex, because there had been the sex conference at Barnard, and Mary and Adrienne were on different sides of the whole censorship issue and the civil rights ordinance, Andrea Dworkin's. Now I'm going back. And so I realized already that there was this whole divide. And if Adrienne Rich and Michelle and we couldn't cross it, and we were next door neighbors, how was anyone, I don't know. That was how it was. And that's kind of what I wanted to look at in the book, a very imperfect movement, and yet an incredibly important one. I think I'm just about out of time.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. I think you have time for one tiny little last question, if somebody wants to sneak one in. But otherwise, I think we're ready to move on to the poets. Thank you so much.